Looking at the screens in front of me and what everyone's reporting on, you've got breaking news. Gregg Wallace has apologised for the video he put out yesterday, saying this is all a whole load of synthetic offence from middle-class, middle-aged women. The BBC, breaking news, MasterChef is still going to be on television. And I'm sitting here going, I don't know how much I care. So let's see if Brendan O'Neill can muster up some enthusiasm on the topic. Brendan, if anything, look, Gregg Wallace is clearly a moron, bawdy sense of humour, has behaved completely inappropriately in the workplace. The BBC, as per usual, cloth-eared when it comes to accusations against one of their talent. But now it seems to be that there's this whole sort of hand-wringing fest over a certain type of person of how awful this is. It's almost like it's being held up as Britain's own Me Too movement. And yet no one gives two hoots if you try and talk about, I don't know, how many undocumented males are coming into the country from societies that don't particularly respect women's rights. But, ooh, Gregg Wallace making a few crude jokes. That's terrible.
Yeah, I really agree. I think, you know, if the allegations are true, then he has behaved badly. You know, men should know by now that you don't make sexist jokes and tell sex stories in the workplace. You just don't do that. It's not the 1970s anymore. So men should stop doing that, that's for sure. So he has behaved badly, and there may need to be some HR involvement or something like that. But aside from that, I just think it's been blown so out of proportion. I really do think it has. And, you know, he's been dragged over the coals. He's been dragged into the public square for a pelting with rotten fruit. And it looks like his whole career is going to be destroyed on the back of these claims. I just think the way in which it's become this massive morality tale for modern Britain is really worrying. And it suggests that the Me Too culture never really went away, and we're seeing it again now in this rather unforgiving witch hunt of Gregg Wallace.
But this is the thing, isn't it? I mean, you know, once upon a time I'd have balked at the idea of somebody calling me a feminist, because it's essentially been a movement that's been hijacked by left-wing people who actually don't care a hoot about women's rights. They'd rather turn everything into a hierarchy of victimhood and synthetic offence. And, you know, all of a sudden this is a safe subject for them to all talk about. Oh, you know, all those sort of very well-paid female celebs coming out saying, and Gregg Wallace upset me, and Gregg Wallace said this, and I was offended, and I felt really scared, and I felt sick to the core, and it made me want to choke on my own vomit, and it was so harmful and horrible. Because this is safe, isn't it? It's a white, middle-aged, working-class man who's behaved pretty badly, and so great, everyone can turn around, point their guns at him and say, isn't the world a horrible place for women? But the problem is feminists in the 21st century don't actually want to talk about the real issues affecting women.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the reason everyone's gone mad about his video where he said it's just a bunch of middle-class women of a certain age, the reason they've gone mad about that is because they know he kind of has a point. Now, I don't think you should mention anyone's age. That's irrelevant, and it can sometimes come off as a bit sexist in itself. But he's not wrong that a lot of feminism these days is a kind of middle-class moralizing that gets packaged up in the language of progressive politics. And often the target of this kind of middle-class feminism does tend to be men lower down the social ladder. You know, men whose swagger and chatter and jokes wind these women up, and these kind of better educated, better off women don't like it. That has been the stuff of feminism for some time, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's playing a role in the Gregg Wallace scandal. You know, the other thing that really makes me smile about this, if that's the right way to put it, is that one of the accusations against him is that he removed his shirt at some point. Now, I don't know if he did that or why he did that, but it is ironic, isn't it, that that accusation is coming from some of the feminists who support the right of so-called trans women to go into women's changing rooms and into women's bathrooms. So apparently it's awful if a middle-class celebrity has to look at Gregg Wallace's moobs, but it's absolutely fine if some woman or girl has to look at the dangly bits of a so-called trans woman in their changing room. So there is this hypocrisy upon hypocrisy in relation to this case, and we see it so often in these scandals these days.
Right, and it also shows, sadly, the sort of loving wearing of the crown of victimhood by middle-class women, because most working-class women wouldn't give a hoot. They're made of stronger stuff. If a man turns around and is being obnoxious, you tell them to pipe down, watch their mouth and get out of your space. And I just don't particularly think that's a positive message to be sending to women, that everything is so frightening and terrifying, and Gregg Wallace represents the greatest harm that could be committed against the female kind. Let's talk now about Jaguar, because after that appalling advert, which is sort of very much taken from the textbook of go woke, go broke, didn't even make any sense, didn't even see a car in it, just a load of people with mad mental illness hairstyles cavorting around in different coloured clothing, representing every single sort of checkbox of wokery that you could imagine, every sort of protected characteristic. Apparently we've now got a sneak preview of what the car looks like. It looks like something they've made in Blue Peter out of a shoebox. Have you seen it?
It's dreadful. I mean, you wonder, is it a joke? Is someone just having us on? Because, you know, it's tragic as well, because Jaguar used to design the greatest cars known to man. Their cars were beautiful and masculine, if one's allowed to say that anymore, and they were sleek and they were much admired by almost everyone. And now they have gone woke. And as a consequence of going woke, they may very well go broke. I think this is the worst case of the Bud Light phenomenon that we've seen for some time, which is when corporations and big businesses try to play the woke card, try to appeal to a certain audience of correct thinking people. And in the process, they trash their own brand. They trash everything they previously stood for. This is the clearest case of that, because we've gone from a company that created some of the most longed for, lusted after cars in human history, to a company that now, as you say, has these strange looking people parading around in its adverts and these Barbie pink cars that look like something made on Why Don't You in the 1980s. It's awful. It really is bad. And I think Jaguar is going to suffer as a consequence of this in more ways than they realise, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. May as well just pack up and leave, forget it. One of the last British motoring greats should just close down its factory and give up. Their cars used to be sexy. That thing looks like it's got some kind of a syndrome. Let's talk about sickness benefits now, because it turns out that if you're on the highest level of sickness benefits, you could be getting to £23,900 a year, which is almost £3 grand more than the minimum wage. Now, no one's saying that £23,900 a year means you're living the life of Riley and, you know, having tea at the Ritz. But it doesn't make sense that not being at work gets you more money than actually leaving your front door and participating in the economy.
Absolutely, it doesn't. And I'm actually really worried about the breadth of sickness benefits these days. You know, I'm one of those people who thinks that if someone genuinely can't work because they have a certain ailment or disability or anything else, then society should help look after those people. There's no question about that. And there are some people who cannot work. They cannot work in the same way that other people can. But so many people on sickness benefits these days don't really need to be on them. And all sorts of ailments or mental troubles or just feeling down or whatever else it might be can now be encapsulated in the sickness benefits definition. And there are a lot of people who essentially have been put out to pasture by the government, put out to pasture by the state, given some money, and then that's it. That's how they live. It's incredibly dispiriting. And also the fact that they could potentially get more in sickness benefits than they would earn on the minimum wage, that acts as a real disincentive to these people to actually go out and look for work. Because often the first job one gets when one goes into the labour market again is a low-paid job. It's often a job that pays the lowest wage, and that can be tough, but it's also can be rewarding for people to work. So I think there's a real disincentive to some of these people who are claiming sickness benefits when they don't really have to, because they know the state will give them more money than a job will. And that's a real worry for this society.
Right, not socialising, obsessing over mental health is exactly the stuff that makes you sick. The integrity and sense of affirmation and purpose when you actually leave the house and meet other human beings and earn some money is what makes us human and makes us mentally well. What is going on with 18 to 25-year-olds? Because they're now the biggest cohort who are not at work.
It's really, really concerning. And I think it is a sign of the times. You know, when I first started working, I was very young. I was 15 or 16 when I got my first job. And all the jobs I did to begin with were low-paid jobs. They were jobs in shops. They were jobs in pubs. You know, the kind of jobs we all do when between the ages of, well, you know, 16 and 21 or whatever it might be. But you're absolutely right. Those are jobs that gave me an enormous sense of autonomy and self-respect. And I made friends and I connected with people and I became probably more socially aware and mentally healthy as a consequence of engaging with the world in that way. I think we live in a culture which continually says to young people, look, the world's a scary place. You might be offended by certain words. You know, your self-esteem might be rattled. Maybe you should stay home and swaddle yourself in cotton wool. We send this very disempowering message to the young in particular, which tells them that they are fragile and the world is dangerous. So I think actually the fact that younger people are not working in the way that they used to, the fact that often they're not really socializing in the way that they used to, or drinking as much as we did when we were kids, or experimenting in those ways as well, I think that's indicative of a culture that has told them maybe it's safer to stay at home than to go out into the big bad world. So our chickens are coming home to roost when it comes to the culture of fragility.
I mean, the problem, of course, as well, is if you are off sick now, you've got plenty to entertain you. Once upon a time, it'd be preferable going to collect trolleys at the local supermarket than sitting and staring at four walls. But now you've got Netflix and Amazon Prime and Disney Plus and Paramount and YouTube and Snapchat and you name it. You can just while away many an hour going down wormholes online, getting stuck in algorithms and making yourself more mentally ill. Let's talk about the latest insult when it comes to the inheritance tax being placed on farmers, which is the fact that you've got this newly elected young MP for the Labour Party from Pembrokeshire, whose family have got a £20 million farm, and somehow, via magical political osmosis, they knew, in order to dodge inheritance tax, to hand this farm to his brother just before Rachel Reeves' announcement. Do you smell a rat?
I do smell a rat. It is fishy, isn't it? To mix my metaphors, there is something potentially going on here. I mean, we do need to see more information. We need to uncover a little bit more, but it does seem a bit questionable. I think, and if that is what's happened, if something was said behind closed doors or in an email or whatever else it might be, then that just makes this whole war on the farmers even worse than it already was. I really cannot believe the way this government is treating farmers. And I can't believe the way in which the whole chattering classes has this incredibly dismissive, almost snobby attitude to farmers. You know, when farmers protested in London the other week, loads of them turning out to defend their right to make our food, you know, that's all they want to do. And you had all this kind of snotty commentary saying, oh, look at these, you know, stupid people in their spec caps in the city centre talking nonsense. It's so horrible. You know, these are the people who make the stuff we eat. These are the people who keep the country running. And it's not an easy job. And the fact that the Labour government doesn't understand that and wants to make life harder for farmers is really indicative of an establishment that doesn't understand ordinary people, ordinary work, and the things that need to happen in order for society to carry on. So if something was said in a whisper to this particular pretty well-off farming family, then I think that makes the situation even worse than it was.
Brendan, do they not understand? Because it's either absolute incompetence, completely detached from what mainstream Britain's all about, which is something outside the M25 where people, I don't know, farm and drive lorries and, you know, have small businesses where they're also going to be hit by employers' national insurance. Do they not understand? Are they that stupid? Or is there, do you ever have a sort of little glimmer of possibility, somewhere in the back of your head, that there is something funny going on here, that Labour actually wants to break up farmland?
They may well want to break up farmland, and that could be happening, but I think probably the driving force right now is just ignorance. That may become something else. That may become something a bit darker or a bit more politically motivated. But I do think there's a large element of ignorance. You know, one of the problems with our political class at the moment is that it comes from a certain section of society. You know, lots of people are celebrating today because I think as of this week, it's the first time in history that the cabinet has been entirely state educated. Now, that is interesting and that is new and that is different to what we've had in the past. But these are still out of touch people. These are still people who got into politics through working in think tanks or in Brussels for a few years or, you know, in kind of committee rooms with some trade union. These are not people who came up to politics in the way that people did in the past, which was by having normal jobs first, working in manufacturing, being farmers, being school teachers, being nurses. Politicians used to have normal jobs before going into politics, and that doesn't happen anymore. So they are a very out of touch elite. I think they live in a Westminster bubble, which means they don't have to think about how things work. You know, how do packages arrive on time? Who makes the milk that goes in their £6 latte that they buy every morning? They don't think about all the stuff that goes under the surface of society that keeps society going. So there's ignorance in it at the moment, but I wouldn't be surprised if it morphed into a larger campaign to break up farming lands and really turn them into something different.
I mean, you know, I think it's great that they're all state educated. It doesn't have to be all of them. I'm state educated. I say bring back grammar schools. That would help when it comes to social mobility. But unfortunately, it's a pretty bad reflection on what our state education system's like, because as far as I can tell, most of the people sitting around that cabinet table are thick. And when I say thick, I'm thinking of Louise Haigh. I mean, this latest twist and turn in the case of the stolen phones is just frankly farcical. The police have now said, so she said she'd been mugged and they'd taken this phone, and then it pinged and it turned out the phone was in a drawer, and the police had sort of been investigating this. Other reports say it was multiple handsets. I don't know what's going on there. I can't imagine the police investigating anything unless there was a sequence of events. I can't see why they'd turn and look into this otherwise, but I don't know. Apparently they've analysed metadata where she said, oh, this phone's been nicked, and sent a photograph of the phone that she had taken after the phone had allegedly been stolen. And what is wrong with these people?
You know, I feel slightly torn on this case, because on the one hand, I find myself thinking, you know, it's not the crime of the century, let's put it like that. And there, you know, and there is a large element. I think she's just behaved stupidly and badly, of course. There's no question about that. But I do think it's been slightly blown out of proportion. But at the same time, and I think this is the more important point, this government just seems fantastically incompetent in every way. It seems to be full of amateurs and charlatans and people who are willing to say one thing to the electorate when they're standing for election and then to do an entirely different thing when they get into power. You know, this is a government that promised to be the adults in the room. They promised to restore normalcy after the chaos of Brexit and Boris, as they saw it. I don't think those were chaotic moments at all. But they promised to bring back expertise and, you know, the kind of normal, sensible middle-class approach to running a country. But in truth, the country's gone to hell in a handcart over the past 5 months or however long it was. We've had riots, we've had farming protests, we've had manifesto promises being broken left, right and centre. We've had Rachel Reeves' CV being called into question. We've had Starmer not being able to answer basic questions about the future growth of the country. We've had the Louise Haigh controversy. It's a government that has found itself steeped in scandal and controversy and incompetence from day one. And that worries me enormously. And I think this case, this incident, this old crime is probably indicative of a government that doesn't know what it's doing. I
couldn't agree more, Brendan. It's so good catching up with you. Do you know, the other day I was driving from Wiltshire back down to London. I was going through the archives, something to listen to on the motorway journey. And I decided to go through the Joe Rogan archives, and I had your company for 3 hours, and it was wonderful, can I just say. I really enjoyed it. Brendan O'Neill, thank you ever so much. And if you haven't ever heard Brendan O'Neill on the Joe Rogan podcast, you should go and do it. It's brilliant.